Welcome, everyone. My name is Nina Benoit. I'm the director of Society at Brightest and the host of the AI Society podcast. So for first-time listeners, this podcast talks about all things related to artificial intelligence or AI and sustainability, exploring how AI can help have a positive impact on our planet and our people, but also what are the potential limitations or threats that we need to be aware of. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Nathaniel Burola, founder of the AI and Environment Resource Hub and former environmental policy analyst at the U.S. Environmental Policy Protection Agency, also known as an EPA. So Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to have you on this podcast. We planned this podcast quite some time ago already, so I'm really happy that it's happening, and also that to have someone joining from the US actually, because all of the interviewees so far were based in Europe. So also very excited to have your perspective. And you're also joining us from Asia today, so we have really the whole world today.
Doing the whole bit of travel from like all over the place. It's crazy. Thanks. Really, really excited to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. So I would really like to start just with the basics here and ask you, why does AI, because this is the topic of this podcast today, to talk about energy and AI. So I would like to ask you, why does AI need so much energy, and why is this a problem that people should think about?
Yeah, no, that's a great question to start off the podcast episode. So I think before we kind of dive into the specifics of like why this is a problem, I think it's important to have kind of like a high level perspective / overview of like why AI needs so much energy like to begin with, because everyone sees it on the news. They see all these data centers being propped up, like, US, Europe, Asia, and everyone's just like, why does this take so much energy? So like from a high level perspective, I think a lot of people don't realize AI requires like a lot of data processing in these data centers, which in turn requires a ton of power to go along with that. So AI also runs on like specialized hardware. So for example, we have all these fancy terms like GPUs, DPUs, TPUs, and all these specialized chips that AI like technically runs on, which requires, again, a lot of power to cool because they produce an excess amount of heat. And so like AI, like in these data centers are like always running 24/7. Like once you turn them on, they have to stay on, from what I can tell, for like 24 hours a day. And the thing is that these data center projects are scaling quickly, like over time. So for example, a great example of this is the Stargate project, where we have like $500 billion of investment with OpenAI, Cisco, IBM, just like a ton of money into data center infrastructure being built in the US. And I believe like following the AI Action Summit in Europe in February, France also announced like X amounts of millions of euros to also kind of do like a similar thing. So the TLDR, or the point of this, is that these data centers have to be turned on 24/7. We are scaling these projects very quickly, which in turn requires more and more and more power to eat. And so we're in this bigger is better mentality with like AI model development and also data centers, where it's like the bigger and, the bigger we build these models, the more capabilities theoretically that they could have. That's still being debated on, I think. Finally, I would say like most AI is probably cloud-based at the moment. So like AI like running on remote servers that are in these data centers. However, that's actually very interesting to note, because as the open source movement with AI grows over time, like DeepSeek and Hugging Face, which is a company that, runs essentially decentralized AI models on their website and servers, that's slowly being changed into like running an open source AI model on your computer and stuff like that, instead of, for example, like a data center. I've seen wacky LinkedIn posts about, for example, archaic computers from like the 80s, like running a very like small AI model, which is insane, because it also raises the question, if you can run a small AI model on an 80s computer, or if DeepSeek comes out with their latest like, R3 model or whatever, why are we spending so much time building this infrastructure, pumping out energy, and also compute at the same time? So that's like the context behind like the high level perspective. And then why is this a problem, to answer the question? So it's kind of a multifaceted It's a multifaceted, like layered problem where like it's kind of like an onion. It's like the more you peel back, the more problems you find essentially. So, for example, in the US, we have an aging infrastructure grid for energy, which clearly has to be like upgraded, maintained, and then also designed with respect to what that's going to look like in the future as more data centers are being built altogether. So you have this energy grid problem that everyone's trying to like tackle. You have ramifications on consumers of power in residential areas with potentially higher utility bills. We'll cover that in your awesome question in Virginia, potentially, which is like a key concern. And then I think at its core, countries are not their some countries are slow to realize that they are not prepared like for this like AI revolution and like what that means for the sheer amount of data centers that they want to build out. I think there's like for example, it appears like, the US has some semblance of like what to do with like let's spend $500 billion on like data center development, but obviously like the US has like a lot of capital, the talent and the infrastructure to be able to do that. But other countries in the world, like for example, if I take Cambodia where I'm based out of, like we don't like I network with a ton of people that are here. I haven't once heard AI or data centers like mentioned in any of the networking groups that I've been part of, except for me. I'm the one bringing that up. So it's like certain parts of the world are going to, experience like faster rates of development with AI and data centers. Others won't. That also is a completely different question, but it is a problem. And it's like an onion peeled layer problem where it's like, okay, the more you peel back, it's like energy grids, folks in their communities having higher utility rate bills. It's a multifaceted problem.
Thank you so much. And I think you already touched upon a lot of
Yeah.
issues that yeah are happening right now, and I think it's also interesting to see how countries like Cambodia might face these kind of issues later
Right.
down the line, so also preparing them
Right.
for what's about to come if more data is going to be stored in
Hmm.
those regions is also a really good point to think about for sure. And so you mentioned, right, that AI uses a lot of energy 24/7. And that's mainly through the storage of data in data centers. So could you tell me a bit more about some ways to reduce this high energy consumption? Do you have any examples to share?
Yeah. So it's interesting because like talk to a lot of data center operators and like companies that are positioning themselves to be more sustainable. So the term sustainable data center is being thrown like a lot now because like I think despite what's happening right now, if we take the US as an example with environmental deregulation in like the next 4 years, a lot of data centers are also like, hey, we use a lot of power, we consume a lot of water, and we're having impacts on communities. So it's like, let's try to be as sustainable as possible. That also said, at the same time, there is a noticeable AI washing slash greenwashing that's like still going on in like certain industries, like like we know. So the label of being sustainable affords like less skepticism from like the general public or research groups that are like, hey, like how much of an impact does your data center have? Oh, but zero because we're net zero because we're a sustainable data center. So it depends, but to give you a couple of examples that I've like seen of like ways that data centers are like trying to reduce their like energy consumption. So the classic example with any big tech expo or panel that you watch is like the industry's AI chips becoming more energy efficient over time. That's like the classic example that I see all over the place. NVIDIA's like Grace Hopper super chip like is quoted to like cut energy usage by up to 10 times in their AI workloads. Or a couple months ago, Google came out with like a paper about their tensor processing units, TPUs, which is like a super advanced I mean, I like to think of it as like a super advanced GPU, but that's not the case at all. It's just like a super advanced AI hardware chip. And it's got like a 3 times improvement in carbon efficiency for AI workloads. So you have industry trying to be very innovative with their AI chips because think about it, the less energy they could potentially use with sheer efficiency, that's like less money that they have to necessarily spend on power costs. So, and like less heat that's also generated too. So it's kind of like a win-win. There are like other ways, for example, like if you're on the more technical side and you're, let's say, an AI like architect or a machine learning architect, there are ways that you can, for example, distribute the loads for training like AI models across like different networks. So, for example, there was a paper out of Hugging Face in 2023 with training the Bloom model, Bloom, and that was like a really cool paper to read because it was like an open source paper essentially talking about the amount of carbon and energy required to train such a large model. So this is more anecdotal evidence based on LinkedIn posts that I remember reading, but I could have sworn I read that in the training of that model, they spread out the training of the AI workloads in different areas depending on like what the energy source was. So for example, France is like super nuclear, right? So like they trained, I think like the majority of like the Bloom model in France, and then they like alternated between like, I don't know, solar in Norway. I'm just throwing out things at that point. But basically the decentralized nature of like, okay, let's do the majority of our training, which is carbon intensive, energy intensive, water intensive, in a country that has the resources to offset the environmental damage compared to, let's say, full training in the US on like a diesel generator, as like an example. Other things that are really cool that I've seen are efficient training methods that a lot of industries have been coming up with. So this is kind of a very nuanced term, but they call it hyperparameter optimization. So that's like totally didn't read that off my screen, but it's like faster learning rates and methods while minimizing unneeded calculations, which is like really cool. That also speaks to like the frugal AI movement and also trying to streamline AI models efficiently with, let's say, like not as much code to produce like not as much carbon. And then finally, I'll just say carbon efficient hardware with like matching of appropriate models. So for example, I think I have IBM has their Telum 2 processor, which can minimize per operation costs when it's matched appropriately with an AI like model and specific hardware. So like that's an example of like matching hardware, like the tech stack, which is called like hardware, software, and then I forget the third piece that goes into that, but effective matching, which is pretty cool. So yeah, those are examples of like reducing energy consumption in like data centers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all these examples. And I think it's really interesting to see how it is evolving so quickly, right? And how
Mm.
some companies are taking the lead, like right with Hugging Face or Google,
Mhm.
and how quickly we can see those developments. So thank you for sharing those
Yeah.
examples. And so another issue that we also see, and you mentioned it briefly at the beginning, is the overload of data centers in
Mhm.
certain areas in the US, especially
Mhm.
like Virginia.
Mhm.
Could you tell me why this is a problem and how we could solve this?
Yeah, no, of course. I think like similar to like your first question, let's like start at like a high level perspective and like even ask the question like what goes into building a data center when like let's say you approach like a certain plot of land in Virginia or Northern Virginia. So based on like the research that I've done, there are a number of factors that like data center operators and companies look at. So for example, power availability and cost. Obviously, that's like the pretty much I think the biggest one at this point. Access to water for cooling in the case if a data center does not have like what they call a water-free design. That's like something that I've been noticing a lot about. There's been some healthy skepticism about like how water-free they actually are, especially with like if you mention like Stargate, for example. I watched a Bloomberg documentary. They have what they call a closed-loop watering system, where they just need like let's say this is not an accurate number at all, but just like 10 million gallons of water up front, you plug it into the system and it just constantly cycles it through. So that's an example of, they call it, I think, like a water-free design because it's a closed loop system. But is it really water-free if you need 10 million gallons up front? So there we go. Ample land availability because these data centers are like massive, especially when we're talking about gigawatts. Connectivity and network infrastructure for minimizing latency and ensuring high-speed connectivity, because that goes back to data centers being turned on 24/7. And also, if you're plugging away at your Hugging Face chatbot, you want a response in a second. You don't want to wait 10 minutes. So there we go. Climate risks are like very big concern, especially now. I think I was reading a couple of like expansion projects in Florida, but people are concerned, hey, if we stick a data center in Florida, it's going to be bulldozed by a hurricane or like a flood. So that's also a very big consideration. When we focus and zoom in into North Virginia, for example, regulatory environmental zoning restrictions, local laws with tax rates, that's like a very big thing. Accessibility and proximity to good infrastructure, because like, if you're building a data center and you want to wheel out your building materials, you want to be close to a highway, for example, to do that. And then I think probably finally, like the one that not a lot of people thinks about is the availability of a skilled workforce. Because one of the problems right now, I think, with like a lot of data center projects is like what does it give the community? So you build this massive gigawatt like data center in their backyard, quite literally. And it's good for the company because they get, tax rebates for power. We're championing the AI cause, yippee all that stuff. But then, like, what does the community get beyond just, let's say X number of jobs that are created in the first year alone during the construction phase of the data center? Like, what happens when it's fully built and, like, you need maintenance staff? There's been that kind of problem. So, for context for your listeners to this podcast, Northern Virginia, this area serves as like the primary source of new energy demand in the Mid-Atlantic region. Projections indicate that the area could require 10 to 15 gigawatts of additional natural gas generators by 2030 to meet data center demand. That's how much demand in this pocket, essentially, of like Virginia exists, I think. And this is according to Aurora Energy Research, which is like a company that does a lot of consulting and stuff, which is cool. So the challenge is that Dominion Energy, not to, call out certain companies, which is not what I'm doing, but Dominion Energy is a power company that's based out of Richmond, Virginia. And so they, along with, the top 10 power companies in the States, are kind of looking towards, this data center demand from like a profit margin where they're clearly saying, like literally, I have a quote from like the CEO, Robert Blue from Dominion: data center customers have continued appetite for additional capacity and have not paused spending on new projects. I think this was literally like this year, even. Is this year? I think, yeah. So it was either, 2025. That was literally this year. That was crazy. That's back in May, even. That's even crazier. So it's like you have all these data center operators that are like, okay, Northern Virginia is awesome. Let's build data centers. But there's a couple of problems with that. So there's so much demand. So contrary to popular belief, and I did not know this until I started studying data centers and what it meant, I thought that when you built up a data center, you could just like hook it up to the grid, no problem, takes a day, that's it. Actually, no. So they call that interconnection requests, where you hook up a data center to a grid. It's not as simple as it sounds. It actually takes like a long time to do that. And there's also a backlog because everybody wants to do that and cash in on this real estate deal. So it takes like 3 to 4 years apparently just to greenlight like new generators and like also build more projects. Now, on the community side, the concentration of data centers can create like a number of issues that people aren't aware of until you start digging into the literature and just watch YouTube documentaries. So, for example, these data centers require so much power, it creates a massive strain on the local grid infrastructure. So I remember this Bloomberg article that I read a couple months ago about folks that were living near a data center in Northern Virginia. Their light bulbs, their home appliances were burnt out because the data center was hopping up so much power, and to the point where they couldn't turn anything on, which was like insane.
Wow. That's
Potentially
crazy.
higher utility rate costs, that. So to be fair, there was a report that came out of an independent agency, I believe, like out of Virginia, that did say that there was no evidence as of, I think, like April or March of 2025 that the power bills had gone up for consumers. But that doesn't mean that it won't. That's the thing. It's like, just because it's not happening now, it doesn't mean like it might not happen in the future. So let's design this in such a way that that doesn't happen. That's the role of like the Public Utility Commission, which is PUC for short. I believe every state has one, and it's up to them to kind of mediate, the concerns of homeowners, companies, all these things. But probably the last important point that I want to make here is that they face so much strain in their communities from these data centers projects. From like land, water usage. There was a viral YouTube documentary, like literally with the title, I live near Mark Zuckerberg's data center, 400, I think, yards away, or whatever the US equivalent is for measurement. And it was crazy. And then just like also, again, what do they get back? Like, do they have more jobs? Like, does this bring tech industry investing into the community, which is like what communities need to be asking? So all of these are good, concerns.
Absolutely. And thank you for giving such a multi-dimensional overview of all the issues that people are facing and what building data centers brings to the area, which
Right.
is, a lot of negatives for sure, some
Right.
positive potentially, but
Yeah.
definitely a lot of problems that needs to be tackled.
I think like
And
with
so to
anything,
end,
good.
yes, to end this conversation, I would like just to, because we haven't had the chance to touch upon that. So very briefly, I would like to ask you a bit more about work that you're currently doing at with the AI and Environmental Resource Hub, and how can listeners interact with it?
Yeah, of course. So currently, right now, I function like akin to like a research consultant. So like I help clients like map out AI solutions to environmental problems if it even needs an AI solution in the first place. Like again, not every environmental problem requires an AI solution, but there are so many cool AI for good use cases that are out there. And so I designed the AI and Environment Resource Hub, which is like an open access database. I think we're up to even like 600 plus like curated resources from like papers all the way to tools that essentially my intent with this was to help stakeholders kind of figure out what the environmental impacts of AI are, and also figure out what the AI for good applications are as well. So that's the whole point of the database, and that's why it's open access. Now, to kind of complement that, I got a lot of good feedback from users, and they were just like, hey, this is great, but I don't have time to read like 600 entries. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, find some way to distribute the information more effectively. So the Climate Code is a weekly newsletter that has the top 3 of the best like categories in each one. My future projects also include kind of this like environmental AI governance tracker that I'm starting very small with, focusing more on water consumption. But it's kind of like a content flywheel where it's like everything feeds into each other. There's the newsletter, there's the resource hub, folks are interested. And then, for more advanced applications, if folks want to actually work with me to figure out like what their AI solution to an environmental problem is, I'm always available for that more advanced application as an actual consultant as well. So that's the work. I could go into way more detail, but like that's that's the short version. That's the short version.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I will definitely make sure to add the link to subscribe to your newsletter and also to the resource hub, because I
Cool.
think that a lot of people who are listening to this might be very interested in reading those resources and reading more research, finding other podcasts, finding other resources that exist on this topic. And you've done a fantastic job summarizing everything. And I've also been using it myself to to do research and
Awesome.
to get more information about so many topics. So it's definitely a really, really good resource that I can
Awesome.
recommend to the listeners.
Appreciate that.
So Nathaniel, it has been a really great conversation. Too short as always. There's so much to talk about. So maybe I need to invite you for a second time
Sure.
to
Don't
talk
mind.
about another topic. But thank you so much for sharing about your expertise on AI and energy applications. That was a very insightful conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I'll see you in another year. You never know.
Exactly. So for those listening, if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it, comment, and connect with Nathaniel or myself on LinkedIn. My name is Nina Benoit, and this is the AI Systemity Podcast. See you next time.